So, we've got this distinction between two different kinds of artworks. On the one hand, we've got these unique physical objects, like Rembrandt's The Night Watch, which was made at a very particular time and space, and it always only exists in one particular location in space at any given time. But then there are these other kinds of artworks, these multiple works, like prints, movies, plays, novels, poems, and those don't seem to exist in any particular place at any given time. There could be multiple copies of them that exist at any given time. Well, now here's the thing we want to do next, is see if we can come up with a theory of what kinds of artwork it's possible to forge or make fake versions of, and what kinds of artwork you can't do that with. And one hypothesis that might strike you on the top of your head is just to say, oh right, it's those unique physical objects that can be forged, but then anything that is a multiple work, well, that can't be forged. After all, you can make all kinds of copies of it that aren't forgeries, so I guess maybe there's no way to forge these kinds of artworks. But people notice that, oh yeah, there do seem to be some kind of multiple works that can be forged. In particular, prints that we talked about before, where an artist carves a block of wood and then paints over that wood and then stamps it onto one piece of paper, but then maybe paints over it again and stamps it onto another piece of paper, so that you make multiple copies. You will have the same artwork, the same print, but located at different points in space at any given time, just like you can have the same novel, Pride and Prejudice, that is located on my bookshelf and your bookshelf and someone else's bookshelf. I can have a Hokusai print in my home. I mean, I don't have enough money to do that, but, in theory I could. You could have one in your home. And they'd be, the instance of the same artwork. And yet, if we took that image that we have, both of us, displayed on a paper in our homes, and if I made an exact replica of the colors and shapes of that thing, but I used it just by carving my own block of wood and using my own paint, and then tried to pass it off as a Hosukai print, well then, no, that would be a forgery. That would be a fake Hosukai. Whereas there's other works of art, like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. If I made a performance of that, I mean, gosh, it seems like as long as I'm just playing the notes of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, it's Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. There's no way that I can create a fake performance of that. So we can't distinguish between artworks that can be forged and those that can't, simply by distinguishing between unique physical artworks and multiple artworks, because there seem to be multiple artworks that can be forged and multiple artworks that can't be forged. So, how do we make sense of the distinction between the top two kinds of art, things that can be forged, and the bottom kinds of art, those that can't? Well, Nelson Goodman comes along and he says, look, we can make a distinction so that we can say that what the top two kinds of art have in common, even though one is a unique physical artwork and the other kinds are multiple artworks, is that they're what we call autographic artworks. And they're distinct from these other things that can't be forged, in that those things that can't be forged, those are what he calls allographic artworks. Now, of course, the question is, well, what do you mean? What is an autographic artwork? What is an allographic artwork? Well, these allographic artworks that are supposed to be forgery proof, what Goodman describes these as are artworks that can be specified by some standard notation. So if you have a musical work, you can write a musical score with all of the notes laid out that tells you, well, look, these are the notes you have to play, the order you have to play them in, how loudly and at what tempo, by what instruments, and as long as you follow those instructions, you will have created an instance of, say, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Same with a novel like Pride and Prejudice. As long as you put Austen's words in the right order, it doesn't matter what font you print them in or what paper you print them on, you will have created an instance of her novel because it can be specified in some standard notation. So anything that follows that notation ends up being an instance of that work. So Goodman argues, look, you can't forge that because it doesn't matter what the history of its creation is. As long as you create something that follows the instructions for making an instance of that work, then boom, that really is a genuine instance of that work. Now, contrast that, on the other hand, with autographic works. So what distinguishes autographic works is that these are things that cannot be specified by some sort of standard notation. So this makes sense both of what those prints by Haikusai have in common and also what, say, Rembrandt's painting, The Night Watch, has in common with those prints. In both of those cases, I could try and write down in some sort of notation instructions for how to arrange certain colors and shapes and lines to create an image that's an exact replica of the image on any Hokusai print or any Rembrandt painting. I could even create really precise instructions about exactly what kind of chemical composition the paint ought to have in the Rembrandt painting. But yet, noting all of that stuff fails to capture something meaningful that's intrinsic to Rembrandt's painting, namely that Rembrandt himself applied the paint at a particular point in history. Similarly, just laying out the arrangements of colors and shapes that you get from a Hokusai print, that notation leaves out something that's essential to what it is to be a Hokusai print, namely that it has been physically stamped onto paper by a block of wood that Hokusai themselves carved. So, both of these works, even though one is a physical, unique object and the other is a multiple artwork that can have multiple copies, they're still both autographic works because you cannot specify what's special and essential to those artworks just by some standard notation. It's always going to be leaving something out, namely the history of that thing's production. It seems really essential to what it is to be Rembrandt's Night Watch, that it was created by a particular person at a particular time, so too by prints of Hakusai or some other printmaker. So, that's Goodman's theory, that we can distinguish between artworks that can be forged and artworks that can't be forged by saying allographic works are forgery proof, you can't forge them, whereas autographic works, those can be forged, and you can make fakes of these things. So, lastly, I'll just go over some of the objections to Goodman's theory here that indicate that, no, this distinction between allographic and autographic works just doesn't capture some things that seem to be essential to certain artworks. So, for example, some people have argued that you could have an allographic artwork that is nonetheless not the same artwork. So it follows the instructions that are laid out in some standard notation, but yet it doesn't count as the artwork that we usually think of as being laid out by those instructions. So, an example is helpful to think about here. So think about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Beethoven, sometime in the early 1800s, composes this symphony. Then people throughout the 1800s and the 1900s and now the 2000s, well, they perform this series of notes that Beethoven put together, and when they do that, they're creating a performance that follows the instructions that would be specified by the standard notation that Beethoven laid down and that people have mostly followed ever since when they create performances of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. But now imagine, do a little thought experiment, that we go to a galaxy far, far away in time long, long ago. You can tell I'm a really bad nerd because I don't know like the classic line from Star Wars. But imagine those musicians at the Star Wars cantina, way galaxy far, far away. It's long, long before Beethoven ever existed, so they don't know Beethoven at all. And yet imagine that on their weird alien instruments, they end up creating the very same sequence of notes with the right, tempo and loudness changes, etc., as Beethoven will later specify, like millions of years in the future. And then we ask, well, did those aliens produce a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony? And you might say, well, they did follow the instructions that would be laid out in a standard notation describing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but you might think, it's not actually Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Why? Well, because it doesn't take place at the right point in history. It doesn't descend somehow from Beethoven's original act of prescribing that those are the sequences of sounds that make up his Ninth Symphony. So there's an example where something that this performance these aliens create is following the instructions that would be laid out in the notation for Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but which you might think is not Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So that indicates to some philosophers that these so-called allographic arts, like musical compositions, may not really be specifiable solely in terms of something that can be laid out in a standard notation. Somehow the history of transmitting that notation might matter. All right, here's one more objection to this claim, that these pieces of music in particular can be characterized in these allographic terms. So again, remember, an allographic artwork is supposed to be one in which you can lay out what's essential to that artwork in some standard notation. Well, performances of those artworks to count as instances of those artworks, they're supposed to follow the instructions that would be laid out in that standard notation. But a lot of folks point out, look, almost every performance of almost every musical work has some wrong notes. Pianists' fingers slip on the wrong keys. Trumpeters, their fingers slip too. So then what do we say? Do we say, oh yeah, most performances that you've ever heard, maybe even all performances you've ever heard of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony are not actually Beethoven's Ninth Symphony because they don't follow the instructions that would be laid out but in the standard notation of what constitutes Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So there's some reason to think that there's something else to what makes a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, other than simply that it follows the instructions that would be specified in notation of what Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is. Because after all, most performances just do not follow that notation. So that's some food for thought. What I've asked you to do on your exam is to think about certain art pieces like Chihuly's glass sculptures or even Catalan's banana, whether that counts as an autographic artwork or an allographic artwork, and whether that's the sort of thing that can be forged or not. It's not entirely clear to me what those answers are, but I want you to use the criteria here to reason out and give your reasons for categorizing those artworks one way or another. All right, that wraps things up. I will give you one more video before the term closes, just to say goodbye, close things up, and put a little button on the term. Stay well, and I'll see you at least one more time.